The Bob Murphy Show, episode 348.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. We have yet another crossover event with Adam Haman of Haman Nature. Today, Adam is going through a list of questions he compiled asking me all about money. And I think you'll enjoy it. Let me mention, in case you watched a bunch of my stuff like Mises University lectures and so forth, you've probably heard me speak on a lot of these topics before, but I promise you, I did try in my answers to say some things that I don't normally mention when giving a public talk on these topics. So I think you'll hear me saying things you haven't heard before. Does that mean it's going to be worth your while to listen to the whole episode? Hey, I don't know you personally, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were. Without further ado, here is Adam Haman hitting me up with a bunch of questions on money.
Hey, Bob. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you, Adam, for another crossover extravaganza.
We are crossing, my friend. We are crossing. In this case, I think the adage would be, do cross the streams? Contra Ghostbusters? So today I was hoping you would humor me. I have questions about something that is vitally important to us every single day.
How long has the problem been occurring?
It would show me where the rash is. Something super important to our society, but something that most of us, myself included, don't understand that well, and that is money. You seem to be the guy that I should ask these things of.
Like Bill Murray. I'm a guy. I'm not the guy.
Well, maybe one day. So I wanted to start off super simple and then get super complicated right here before the end of our currency. I've heard over the course of my life and in school and various places, various definitions of what money is. I've heard that it's a store of value and it's a unit of account. And my personal favorite, a generally accepted medium of exchange. And I'm wondering if you're fine with all those definitions, or do we Austrians have a different one or a different way to look at the subject? How do you define what money is?
Sure. So I subscribe on most things to the view of Ludwig von Mises, and not merely reflexively, like just, because he's my hero, or because for one thing, my hero is Eugen von Bavarik.
Yes,
That wouldn't even make sense to idolize Mises. But specifically, so I wrote the study guide to the theory of money and credit, and really Mises is just a genius. And so what he had done in that book, I think that came out in 1912. I think to the extent that you wanted to call something Mises' doctoral dissertation, I think it would be that, even though it's not quite analogous, I think. But in any event, he went through all these different classification schemes, and should money be included in part of national wealth and all kinds of things like that. Is it capital? What is it? Is it a consumption good? So the definition he used, and he would give the rationale for his views. So that's what I'm just saying. He really spent a long time thinking through these things. So I come down to, unless I have reason otherwise to deviate, I don't know if we're going to get into Bitcoin later in this discussion, but there I could see possibly a route for a new category in the taxonomy that Mises came up with, types of money. But at this stage, what Mises said is the one you mentioned, that he said what money is, like the definition of it is, it's a medium of exchange that is generally accepted in the community, or you could say almost universally accepted or widely accepted. So on that, just to define those terms, so a medium of exchange means it's something that you accept and trade, not because you're going to directly consume it, and not even because you're going to use it directly in production, but because you're going to trade it away again in the future. So that's what it means to be a medium of exchange. So there, that word medium, it's not like small, medium, large. It's rather like sound travels through the medium of air, or a medium helps you, connect to the spirit world. So the medium is the thing through which something occurs. So there, a medium of exchange means you're ultimately trading, you're giving away something to get something down the road, and the money, that commodity is just the medium to affect those exchanges. But that's not enough to be money, just to be a medium of exchange. Then it also has to be the case that in a given community, everybody, or virtually everybody, considers that particular good to be a medium of exchange. And then boom, that's what it means to be money. And then he says, if you have that being the case, the other things that we traditionally associate with money, like being
Come
a
right
store
along.
of value,
Yeah.
or whatever, it kind of goes along with that. So
Yeah.
that's his take. And like I say, if somebody else, I know other economists have different approaches. I'm not saying I would go to the barricades and say they're wrong. I'm just saying Mises didn't pick that just because, like, he really thought long and hard about the definitions he chose. And he also deviated sometimes from Bobaverick, who was like his teacher in a sense. So I'm just saying Mises really had reasons for those things. And that definition has guided me well, I think, like to say, is Bitcoin money, or that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, I tend to agree. As I was debating about those three particular definitions, and I came down thinking that generally accepted medium of exchange was more important, it occurred to me, of course, that if you have that one, you have the other two. That's what makes it a store of value and or a unit of account. It sort of comes along. Do we know how money arose somewhere in the universe? Do we have any good theories about it? I doubt we have any good history on it, but
yeah, so great question. I'll try to keep these things brief to keep this more conversational. So this has been an area of controversy relatively recently, at least back as far as Adam Smith, and Menger was the one. Carl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school, is the one who actually had the entry in, I think it was like the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences or something like that. Like it was a book of that nature, where he was given the entry. Carl Menger wrote up the entry on like the origin of money or something like that. And so we in the Austrian tradition tend to really like Menger's approach, but I'm saying what a lot of Austrians think of as Carl Menger's theory for the origin of money, if you go read Adam Smith, which was earlier because Smith is 1776 and Menger's 1871, it's the spirit of it is largely the same, right? So this is more economists in general, not just the Austrians. And so it wasn't a history, and nobody claimed that it was. It was more, you can try to be cynical about it, and it's like more of a thought experiment, just sitting around thinking about it. But it was pretty compelling, I think, to show what Menger showed is if everybody starts out with in a state of barter where there is no money, and he just showed step by step how people acting in their narrow self-interest without intending to, quote, create money or even knowing what money was, it would naturally emerge out of that. Yeah. And so I think the story has to be something like that, because money's clearly coming from humans. It's not like a tree or something. Like, it's clearly a human thing. But on the other hand, if you grew up in a world without money, it's kind of a weird concept, and it's not likely somebody would have just thought of that. And so that's why I like Menger's approach. So do you want me to go through what it was real fast, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Probably since you asked me where did money come from, and I haven't told you. I've told you where Menger's story comes from. Okay. So real quickly, the basics of the story that Menger gave us is you got a condition of barter, and so people would have a general idea of the relative values of things. And when I say value in this context, I mean market value. Like, oh yeah, if you have this many eggs, you can go in the market and trade it for this many chickens or whatever, or rather one chicken would probably trade for a bunch of eggs and a bunch of pears and apples and so forth. A horse presumably would trade for a lot of different things. And so even so, there's a different dimension. It's not just the stuff you have, what's its value relative to other goods and services people might have to sell, but the saleability or the liquidity or the marketability. And so specifically yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to set the stage a little bit, since there is no money yet, I have to assume that we must assume that this is a super primitive economy. Like we're
Yeah.
talking about families, maybe they're producing their own farm, their own little plot of land, or they're growing rutabagas or something, and it comes about that they got some excess that they don't want to eat, and maybe they want to trade with their neighbors, so they engage in some kind of a barter economy. And so that's the level we're at. It's not like we're talking about there's huge factories or anything yet. It's super, super, super primitive, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the difficulty with this kind of storytelling is obviously without knowing the particulars, it's hard to come up with a plausible, like I think Menger might have even talked about a telescope to show something that's very unsaleable, right? Well,
but it would never,
nobody would, yeah, they wouldn't have had a telescope at this point. All right. So, but anyway, just the basics of the story. So you're going into, I was going to say going into town. There probably wouldn't be towns in this primitive, but just to get the logic across, you're going into town with a bunch of eggs, let's say, and what you really want is tobacco. Unless right on that trip you find a tobacco farmer who also wants eggs, you're out of luck, right? And so you'd have to leave empty. And then the problem with eggs is they're perishable. And so in lieu of finding the exact counterparty of what you want, if instead you saw somebody who's willing to sell wheat in exchange for your eggs, you might make that trade because you think, okay, the wheat holds a little bit longer, and then also wheat's pretty marketable. And, I'll probably find a tobacco farmer who maybe wants some wheat or that kind of deal. And so that was the idea. And so in general, people going into market who have something that's relatively illiquid. Again, I think the example Menger used was if you had a telescope that was very intricate, that would be very valuable, right? If you could find the right buyer, that person would be willing to give a lot for this telescope. But in general, on any given day, there's not a lot of people in the market who are looking to buy a telescope. Okay. In our modern context, think of like a house. Like a house could be very valuable, but it's illiquid, whereas shares of stock. So the idea here, in our terminology, what does it mean to be liquid? You can turn it into money pretty fast. That's what we mean. So back then, if we're talking about before there was money, that's not the definition, but the idea is how quickly could you turn it into something that would have its rough economic value. And so what I mean by that is, and I know I'm getting into little nitpicking things, but technically this is what it would have to mean to think it through. Yeah, you could probably, if you went into town with a bunch of eggs, find somebody who would give you just about anything, but they might, quote, not give you a good deal for it.
Sure.
And so even if what you ultimately wanted is, when I say tobacco, the guy who has the wheat, if he was going to say, oh yeah, give me all your eggs and I'll give you a handful of wheat, you might say no, just because that's not the amount.
You can imagine.
Yeah,
you can imagine that person walking into town, and maybe they can't find exactly what they want. The double coincidence of needs has not been achieved. Mm-hmm. And maybe they can't find something that works real good as a money, but maybe they can find something that's like better.
Right.
Where they can get a reasonable deal, like a cord of firewood or something.
Exactly. And, yeah. So the nitpicking thing I'm doing there just for the pure, also I'm trying to add value here for people who've read this stuff. I haven't seen people really stress this that it's not enough just to find someone who's willing to trade for your real illiquid thing to give you something that's more liquid. Again, the terms on which they do it has to be such that you still think, okay, yes, I'm fine now going around. Like, they gave me enough wheat so that when I do find the tobacco farmer who wants wheat, it's not that I'm going to be in a much worse position than if I had just shopped around a little bit more to unload my eggs with somebody else who was going to give me whatever.
Which is one of the other benefits that money gives the community, right? It smooths out those situations where, someone will just give a bad deal. Those situations won't come up nearly as much because you're dealing in.
Yeah. So specifically the way money helps, and then it's just, to try to jump ahead maybe to if you're going to say, what's the benefit to us of using money? So notice there, to say like, oh, am I getting a good deal for it? Strictly speaking, you would have to know. So you're going into town with eggs. You got a bunch of eggs. And let's say you said, oh, I really want to get, what would tobacco be in bushels? I don't buy tobacco in bulk, so I don't even know. Would it be bushels?
Sure.
I want to get a bushel of tobacco, and I got a bunch of eggs. And so then someone who has the wheat and is willing to trade you a certain amount of wheat for that, you would have to know what's the exchange rate of wheat for tobacco to know if I give my eggs to this wheat guy, is that going to then put me in a position? And there too, if the reason you're partly accepting the wheat is just because it's more marketable in general, maybe you still have maybe I got to then take the wheat and go trade it for some boots, because I think there's probably a tobacco farmer out there who wants boots.
Presumably, way back then in a tiny community, you'd also be playing on the varying interpersonal preferences for various things. Like you'd rather, all things equal, go find a guy who really likes eggs for some reason, and maybe you'll get, even if he doesn't have what you want, or maybe if that thing isn't really, really good money, maybe if he just likes eggs more, you can make a better deal.
Perhaps. So with all these things that we're showing, though, if it's just barter where we're just doing direct exchange, you got to keep a bunch of different relative ratios in your head to guide you as you're deciding, do I want to, if I make this trade, is that taking me a step closer to my ultimate? Whereas if everything trades against the same good, or in other words, if in every trade there's one commodity that's on every side, then it simplifies it. Then all you got to remember is one list of prices, period. And so you can just know that, like, is it a good deal to sell to this guy or whatever? You get the money and you go. So anyway, that's kind of.
No, I think that's great. I have two questions. I don't know how related they are. One is Menger's explanation seems perfectly obvious to me.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just for the listener who hasn't read it through, I technically didn't finish it. Like, if you give me 30 more seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry, man. Go ahead. Go ahead.
We're leaving them hanging. They're just going to be like zooming ahead in 30-second increment. When are they going to come back and finish it? I'm dying here. So if you buy that people going into town with relatively illiquid goods, if they can't find exactly what they want, would be willing to accept something that's more saleable or more liquid. Once that begins to catch on, then that enhances the saleability or the marketability of the things that originally had an advantage, right? So if you're going into town with something that only a select few want, and then you're willing to accept something that's more popular because you think in general I'm more likely to come across someone who wants this thing because it's more popular, that enhances the popularity of that thing. Because now even you, if you're not a direct user of it, since you'll accept it, now the network of people who will accept this thing has gone up by one. And so that process can snowball, and until you get to the point where one or a few commodities is basically accepted by everybody, and then boom, that's what a money is. And so historically, why was it things like gold and silver? Because they had attributes that made them very convenient for serving that purpose. And so that's why they ended up. So to be easily divisible and the other, homogeneous and so forth, that's not the definition of a money, but goods that have those properties are more likely to be selected as, or to emerge as, the money in a given community if there's no outside intervention.
And among the benefits we get, we can accumulate capital easier, since the money doesn't perish, doesn't spoil, and we get to specialize in, division of labor, focus our attention in a narrow thing, because finding somebody who wants to trade for our specific narrow thing, it's got to be a slow growing process, but it was, don't you think, the invention of money that allowed us to develop more complex structures of production and complex societies than just a rudimentary farming sort of village or whatever?
Yeah. So, there's different layers of looking at it, but just even if there was no production, even if just people had, it's called an endowment economy, like in an economic model, just coconuts are shooting off trees and some people are just grabbing fish from their, the stream in their backyard or whatever. If everyone is just kind of reaping what nature's throwing off, but we have different things, Some guys got a ton of coconuts, some guys got a bunch of fish, some guys, got tons of tomatoes that are shooting out of the ground. And so then we all go into having a money for just the reason I said earlier, allows just the rearrangement patterns of the existing stock of goods to be such that more people can walk away happier than if you just had to rely on one-off swaps that both parties benefited from. So the idea being, like, just picture three people in a community and they each come to town with one bundle of stuff. If they all kind of just hand the bundle to the right, or kind of like clockwise or whatever, picture how you're picturing the people in your mind, they can all walk away better off. But that might, to do that though, might involve, like, no one-off trades would work, right? That if no two people wanted what the other guy had, but it was more like, if we could all agree to just swap things twice, then we'd all be better off. That can work. So again, that's what money allows to happen. It just makes the calculations and looking ahead at much simpler computationally. And so,
Yeah, absolutely.
so it's that. And then, like you say, so that's just even if the production's fixed, if just every period people get the possession of a bunch of stuff and then they want to just rearrange it among themselves, like kids with Halloween candy or something, still everybody, people can benefit from that. But then once that's in place, now it gives you the freedom to specialize more heavily, because now, it's easier for me to, if I have a ton of fish or a ton of coconuts, to go unload them and get the stuff I want. Given that we're all using money now, that gives me the incentive to, I can afford to be more reliant on my cash crop, as it were, like no pun intended, right?
Right.
Whereas if you didn't have money and things were more sporadic, then you might not want to, your own household might have to be more self-sufficient because we, in a pinch, we're just going to have to live on our own produce. Whereas again, once money allows for a much more effective exchange of goods among people in a community, then each person can specialize more because it's not as risky to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So that makes perfect sense to me that money is an emergent phenomenon, as it were, whether we can prove it historically or not. Which makes me wonder, what are the competing theories about, some sort of a top-down approach to money, and who holds them, and how did Mises and his regression theorem help support Menger in his claim?
Okay, sure. So different types of theory. I guess the rival theory is what's called the state theory of money.
Right.
I think a guy named Knapp advanced that with a K-N-A-P-P, I think is how you spell his name. More recently, David Graeber, who I think passed away in the not too distant past, he was an anthropologist, I think is what his actual profession was. And so he wrote a book that was big in certain nerdy academic circles called Debt, the First 5,000 Years or something like that, where it's a history of debt, and it's kind of audacious. And one element in his book is what he thinks is an absolute obliteration of the economist self-serving theory of the origin of money. And Graeber advances basically a state theory of money, so that there were wise chieftains or elders, if it's more of a tribal community, and they just basically said, this is the money, everybody, going forward. Oh, okay. And then that's where money came from. And it's difficult because, strictly speaking, it's not that we have some historical record to say, and on this date, when the planets were configured like this in the sky, so-and-so invented money and gave it to us, right? And again, that's not surprising, partly just because that would have been a conceptual leap, but also, again, I think money allowed for human progress and flourishing such that you wouldn't expect there to be a bunch of writings from an advanced civilization that wasn't using money. Like, in order for there to be writings bequeathed to us that we find, those people probably had money. So there's that element. So what Graeber says, like in his critique of the economistic explanation, that's a version of the same thing I just told you here, is that, there's no record of a barter community. But again, for the same reason, right? Because why would there be? The story I told is pretty straightforward. You would think if you started in barter, it would emerge pretty fast. So you wouldn't find records like that. And then the thing that I just thought was hilarious is one of the historical examples he gave, like to say, instead of me sitting around just doing my armchair theorizing, I'm going to go look at the evidence. Imagine that, right? So that's their shtick. And I get why, if you like their conclusions. And these guys, a lot of them are very either outright socialists or left-leaning.
Of course.
And so, so for them, you see how it's ideological? Like, just like we like to say, see, we didn't need the state to invent money. It emerged spontaneously. Likewise, they like it that, you needed the state to, give us this, just like you need the state to do all sorts of other things too. But in any event, one of the examples he focused on, and I have this in my article, people want to look up, it's called The Origin of the Species. So it's a very clever title that they came up with.
Very nice.
And so I quote from his book if you want to go see it in his own words and everything, but it was saying, it was the temple, the religious authorities that came up with the unit, and it was the shekel of the temple, and that's what and guess what it was? It wasn't some abstract unit like a Satoshi. It wasn't something that was easily reproducible, but not important, like a seashell or that they could go grab is what I mean, like a seashell. No, it was silver. And so saying that seems like a pretty big coincidence. That could have been anything according to you, and yet they picked a thing that I can clearly explain why that was the money using the Mengerian framework. And the last thing I'll say on that is we kind of do have a real world experiment of the POW camp. So there was this guy,
Right.
Radford, in World War II. I think he was with the Royal Air Force and was shot down, but I might be making that part up. But he was definitely a POW in a German camp, and he was in civilian life. He was an economist, and so he was a great person to watch what happened. And then he published an article afterwards. I think it was called "The Economics of a POW Camp," and among other things, he was saying when they let the Red Cross come in and give the prisoners ration, buckets or something every period, and they would come with cigarettes. And so that just became the money in the camp. They would have chalkboards up and just have prices to say how many cigarettes for whatever, a can of ham or something, or a bottle of water or whatever. And that was just how, if you need some new shoelaces, what's that? And that's how they would keep track of it. And it was neat too. Like they would do things like, originally it was defined as a cigarette, but then people would unroll the cigarette and try to like knock out some of the tobacco and then roll it back up and try to pass it off.
Clipping
And
coins.
So, yeah, exactly. And so it became understood. No, when we say cigarette, what we mean is the amount of tobacco in a standard cigarette. That's really what the money is. It's the tobacco. We're just measuring, the cigarette is like the unit of measurement. So anyway, it was all, and then, and he talked about inflationary periods. When some guy started bribing the guard and they could bring in cartons of cigarettes. Well, I don't know if they were cartons, but bringing outside cigarettes, and then all of a sudden prices quoted in tobacco started rising.
Sure. Yeah.
So anyway, it was just neat stuff like that. But my point being, it was not that the German guards said, from now on, you owe us 1 cigarette per day or else you get beaten. And so therefore the cigarettes became money. That's kind of the state theory's analysis. And certainly like the MMT people in the recent MMT documentary, that's explicitly the theory they gave, is that, oh yeah, where money comes from is the state imposes taxes in a certain currency. Now everyone has to scramble to get that currency, and then that's what gives the money its value.
That's so funny, like you were alluding to, without, historical evidence, two groups of people with two completely different ideologies come up with two different theories. If you believe in that natural order, is emergent, and you come up with our theory of money. And if you believe that order can only be imposed from some wise group of elites, you have the competing theory, and no evidence has to come into it at all. It's just a theory. I mentioned Mises and his regression theorem.
Oh, yeah.
Did you want to talk about that, or?
Sure. Yep. So Mises' regression theorem, what he was doing is actually solving a problem in economic theory. So in 1871, Karl Menger publishes the Grundsatz, which we translate as Principles of Economics, where basically the Austrian school is born. And what he did there that is recognized just in standard histories of economic thought is he was one of the pioneers of the so-called marginal revolution. So it overturned the old classical cost or objective theory of value and replaced it with the modern subjectivist marginal approach. And so economists, and that swept the field, and everybody agreed, yep, if we're going to look at like a barter economy with people, some guys have apples and some have oranges, and what's the exchange rate, the real exchange rate of apples against oranges to create equilibrium prices, blah, blah, blah. They agreed with this new framework, and that's the way to do it. But it seemed like there was a circular argument to try to apply that new marginal subjectivist framework to understanding the market value of the money commodity, at least insofar as you were looking at it for its moneyness, right? As opposed to just, well, if it's gold, if people like it for industrial or purposes or jewelry, but gold being held because it's a medium of exchange, that extra portion of its value, how do you explain that? And it looked like you were arguing in a circle to say, oh, well, the reason I would accept money in exchange for my labor or, my car or whatever is because it's valuable to me, right? Because that's what you'd have to say. Like, why would you do, it's subjectively the money I'm getting in the trade is more valuable to me than the thing I'm giving away. Okay. But then if you say, but why is it valuable to you? And say, oh, because I know I can trade away for something down the road. So it has purchasing power. And so that, it seemed like you were just arguing in a circle because you were saying, okay, so you're explaining the purchasing power of money ultimately by saying it has purchasing power. So it's not that that's wrong, but it just seemed like you're not getting anywhere. And so that was kind of the rut that economists had been in. And they had this bifurcated, like, oh, we use subjective marginal utility to explain real exchange ratios, but then to explain absolute money prices, they had a whole different framework of like the velocity of circulation and what's the total quantity of money. It was just a completely different framework to explain money prices. And so Mises comes along, and again, this is partly what he did in his 1912 work, and said, no, it's not a circular argument, that you're not explaining the purchasing power of money today by reference to today's purchasing power. Yep, that would be circular, but that's not what we're doing. When people accept money right now in a trade, what they're doing is they're expecting what its purchasing power will be in the near future. They're envisioning it, they're imagining it, and so that's what's guiding their behavior. And then where do they get those expectations from? From their memory of seeing money's purchasing power in the recent past. So he broke out the time element. So it's the way I would summarize it is to say today's purchasing power is based on the expectations of tomorrow's purchasing power, which were formed from viewing yesterday's purchasing power. So Mises didn't say it like that, and then that gives you, so then it looks like, oh, so now it's just an infinite regress. You just got to go back forever. And he said, no, you keep going back conceptually, not like you go get a history book, but just logically speaking, until the point at which the money good was only being used, in barter. And then you can stop there because we know how to explain barter with this new thing that Mendel gave us.
No, it's brilliant.
So it regresses, it regresses back to the point of barter. So that's what the regression theorem is. And so he was just kind of like trying to plug the logical holes in using the new subjective margin utility theory applied to money. And so then Mises could say, boom, I'm applying the same value theory to everything, including the money commodity.
No, it's brilliant. And this comes up over and over again when I compare Austrian economics with the more mainstream things, is we view time, I think, in a more realistic way than they do. And it brings me to my next question, which is a doozy. I'm not sure how to frame it exactly. So the money commodity just starts out as a commodity, and it has a certain use case value. And then it starts to become demanded more as a medium of exchange. So it goes up in value up until the point where its current value is many, many, many multiples of what its original use case value would have been if you were to try to break it apart into sections.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look at our own modern history, we were using a commodity as money. And then we were using government issued or bank issued, vouchers as the money. And then through one government mechanism after another, culminating in Nixon's closing of the foreign exchange window, we all of a sudden are ending up using a fiat currency that is tethered to no use case. It's worth nothing except as a very ugly wallpaper for your bathroom. Which makes me think, in the modern world, is something like gold, if we were to somehow eliminate fiat and get back to a more free market money, does something like gold that does have a direct exchange use, it is a commodity, even though that value is completely dwarfed by its exchange value, does that make gold a more true or useful or durable money than something like Bitcoin, which has its own advantages over gold, like it's completely capped at 21 million of them. And even though it's literally backed by nothing, and it's just ones and zeros in a computer that could get turned off by a sunspot or something. But it just makes me think that because we're so divorced from the commodity value of the thing, does it really matter that it even had one? How do you think about that?
Okay, great stuff. So, folks, if you want to see more on this, I'll just allude to some of these points. Go to understandingbitcoin.us. I just checked to make sure the URL still works. So that's where I have the Understanding Bitcoin guide that I co-wrote with Silas Barta. He was more the engineering, like the mechanics of it, just explain the cryptographic keys and whatnot, and I did more of the econ. So yeah, great question. So in case this is somehow not on people's radar, especially when Bitcoin first came out, there were plenty of hardcore Austrians who were very skeptical of it. And to this day, even guys like Peter Schiff still are. And their argument was, hang on, doesn't the Mises regression theorem, that's awesome, right? And so if Mises is saying, they took Mises to be saying anything that is a money must have had a history, if you trace it far back enough, which at one point in the distant past, it was just a regular commodity. And so they thought, so surely Bitcoin can't. Oh, and by the way, I should say, in case you're wondering, like, oh, so is he saying US dollars nowadays aren't money? No, it is. he would think it's a bad type of money, but he would say there you could trace it back, and then where people got their expectations of the purchasing power of U.S. dollars, you trace it back until, at one point it was tied to gold. So like that's what gave the link. And so it's not that there has to be some like legal link or something. It's partly just to form a basis for expectations. That was one of Menger's critiques of the state theory of money. If some king just held up a shell and said, from now on, folks, he probably wouldn't say folks, from now on, citizens or subjects, this shell, like every time you want to make a trade, you got to first go through, do it against these shells. Well, in the beginning, nobody would know what the shells were worth. He would say, okay, if I want to sell a horse, do I accept it for 2 shells or for 1,000? I have no idea. You see what I mean? So that's part of the issue. So that's why you kind of need that continuity just to know what the ratios are.
Sure.
So that's where to explain, or like the euro, which was created compared to other fiat currencies, right? So but again, when they defined it, it was well specified. And then you could figure out, a French franc, you could trace that back until the point at which it was tied to gold and so forth. Okay, so that's what he did. So with Bitcoin, though, a lot of hardcore Misesians were saying, Bitcoin, it's never like you could use it in a sandwich or to build a house with it. It just emerged ostensibly being a money type thing. So how could that ever really be money? So let me just make, and then we can get into, I'm not going to just be evasive, but just some easier points to make. Both Mises and Rothbard did say, if in the future people stopped valuing money for any direct reason, like they stopped liking gold jewelry, it stopped being useful in industrial applications, still, they said, it could still serve as the money. Because again, people would have needed the link historically, is going into it. If you understood what do you expect the purchasing power of an ounce of gold to be tomorrow? All you would need to know is the recent past. The fact that over time people stopped using gold in their teeth or whatever, or for arthritis treatments. I think my grandma used to get injections of gold. We used to joke about that. She was a $6 million woman. Right. So if all that faded away, still people would have, that wouldn't be any logical stumbling block to knowing what I think the purchasing power of gold is going to be tomorrow. Right. So that'd be fine. So that Mises and Rothbard, and that's in that understanding Bitcoin, if people want to go look that up, that is explicitly in there. So there is that element. And so my point is, given that Bitcoin has a purchasing power right now, like we all know what Bitcoin will fetch you in the market right now. So it's not that there's some looming problem and one of these days Bitcoin's going to go to zero because everyone's going to say, oh my gosh, I never used this to make a sandwich, right? There's no reason for that to happen. So the point is, my argument is, if you think Mises' regression theorem had something to do with being a stumbling block for Bitcoin to become a money, it would have already happened. We're already past that point.
Right.
To be clear, I'm not saying Bitcoin is money right now because I don't think it's universally accepted, even within a given community that makes sense. But my point is just, it should have kicked in before. And so
I think the Mises' point explains how we got here. It doesn't predict what's going forth, and things are valuable because they are subjectively valuable. And if we decide it's money and everybody keeps continuing to accept it, well, then that's what it is, right?
Yeah. I'm okay if people want to say that there was kind of a hole in Mises' argument. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sympathetic to that. I'm not trying to just say, no, Mises is always right, and I'm going to come up with some way. Like, if what you just said, I should say, Adam, sounds to some people like, oh, come on, you guys are just afraid to admit that Lou screwed up on this one. I'm okay with that. What I'm just saying, though, is it seems like there was this class of Misesians, including Peter Schiff, who, yeah, Bitcoin's at 10,000. Oh, it's going to crash. Now it's at 20,000. Nope, it's all a bubble. No, it's at 30,000. And the point is, it's too late for that. Like, it could go to zero anyway, but the point is, it wouldn't be because people would have no idea what its frame of reference should be. And that's why, maybe just to finish that train of thought or to connect it, that's why your question about what if gold lost its other uses, that's why that's so valuable, because at least Mises and Rothbard thought, oh, it's not that, well, once it lost that mooring or that anchor of being tied in some way to real world applications, then all of a sudden gold is 100% a bubble, and for all we know, it's going to go to zero next Tuesday. Like, that's Mises and Rothbard didn't say that, so there's no reason Bitcoin now, because it has no direct uses besides being an asset that people trade, should plummet to zero, like in terms of the fundamental value. At least Mises and Rothbard didn't think that was true of gold. Yeah,
that's great. I didn't realize they said that, but that answers my question. I mean, they didn't think, at least, that there was any conceptual problem with a society just continuing to use something that has worked for them in the past as money and keep keeping on using it as money, even though it does not have a direct use case anymore.
Yep. Just to be clear for the hard money gold bug guys, to be clear, Adam, Mises and Rothbard still thought, of course, gold had that historical connection. You know what I mean? So they were still thinking, oh, everything that becomes a money must have been traceable back to some normal commodity. We're just saying if it lost those applications, if it had once attained money status, there's no reason that it would need to forfeit that status just because. And you were also right, Adam, I wanted to stress, that was one of the cool things Mises said in his theory of money and credit. By the way, Guido Hulsmann says he thinks that's a bad translation because obviously Mises wrote it in German. He thinks it would be more, they should have called it the theory of money and fiduciary media, in Guido's opinion, but Guido's not the average man. And so Mises has a thing in there where he clarifies and he said, notice, I am not saying the way as economists we should evaluate the value of money is just as a commodity. He was saying, no, he said, especially with gold and silver now, much of their current market value is because of their status as a money. So, to address what you were saying, Adam, that's the thing. And Mises even said something like, to try to explain the purchasing power of money merely by reference to its commercial or industrial applications would be to evade your role as a monetary economist in the first place, or something like that. He's saying you're completely sidestepping the whole point. So anyway, that's the way he would explain, and that's what I would say to like a Peter Schiff or something, that using Schiff's reasoning about Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. Okay, but even on Schiff's own framework, gold, a big percentage of it, quote, isn't based on intrinsic or fundamental value either. And so is Bitcoin like an 80% bubble? I don't think gold bugs would think like that.
Yeah, I don't either. And it's a question that has to be answered. All right. So if you're satisfied talking about healthy-ish monies like gold and Bitcoin, I'd like to pivot to the wretched thing we're forced to use now and just how screwed we are as a country. I got my little Thomas Massey debt badge here, and I don't know if you can see that, but we're 35 trillion 0.32 in debt and going up by $1 trillion every 100 days, if I read correctly. So I have several questions. I'm going to fire them at you, and you answer whichever ones you think are most relevant. A is, how screwed are we? B is, what happens if we default on it? Who are the debt holders? What do you think the repercussions would be? Are there any other options to get out of debt? Some genius had a super bright one to just mint a coin and say it's worth $1 trillion or something and have the Fed buy it out of counterfeit money for that. That can't be right. Do you think there's any options of just getting out of this debt, or do you think it's either going to crash the currency or we're just going to have to default, literally, not just inflate our way out of it, but literally default?
Folks, let's take a break from the action for this special announcement. Time is running out, and I mean that in two senses. First, look at the world. Things are spiraling out of control. Your time to prepare for this is running short. The second sense is your time to get ready for the ExPat Money Summit is also running short, because it occurs on October 7th through 11th. So hurry up and get ready for it. What is the ExPat Money Summit, you say? It's the world's largest offshore event. It's put on by Mikkel Thorpe, host of the ExPat Money Show. So this, to be clear, is entirely online, again, October 7th through 11th. If you attend the seminar, you're going to see why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth. You're going to learn everything you need to know about getting your Plan B up and running, such as acquiring a second passport, diversifying your finances offshore, investing in international real estate. And you're going to get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. These include people like Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, Mark Faber, and Tom Luongo. Now, I'm going to be participating as well. I'm on a VIP panel devoted to the topic of dedollarization and, the pace with which we might expect that and some of the complications arising from it and ways that we think it may play out. To get your complimentary ticket, just go to expatmoneysummit.com. However, if you want to have access to the VIP panels, which includes me, you're going to have to go ahead and get the VIP pass. If you do so, make sure you use promo code Murphy to get a special discount. So again, the general event, it's free. Go to expatmoneysummit.com. But if you want to get the VIP pass, make sure you use promo code Murphy. Let's get back to the show. Okay, so yeah, in terms of just the trends and whatnot, I mean, you don't have to go to the Heritage Foundation or something. You could just go to the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, look at their long-term economic outlook, and it's showing that we're roughly, in terms of the public debt held by the public, right? And that meaning like not talking about the Social Security Trust Fund, that is a share of GDP. Just using all the conventional official numbers, that ratio, it's above 100%, and it's just going to keep going up, and it's roughly where it was at the peak right after, near the end of World War II. And so the difference between, so on one hand, you might say, okay, so, right, it's been this bad before. So, but yeah, at the end of World War II, though, there had been several years of a crazy amount of a one-off emergency expenditure that then, spending was rapidly slashed. And that's what allowed, it's not that they paid off. They actually did run a surplus for, I think, like a year and a half or something, maybe even a couple of years. But it was more that the debt in dollar terms didn't rise that rapidly in the 50s and 60s. And so the nominal size of the economy grew faster. So that's why the debt as a percentage fell. But it'd be hard to do that right now is my point. It's not like, oh yeah, we were spending $3 trillion a year because of COVID, and now we can make that go to zero. That's not, they did jack up spending during COVID, but still the baseline has risen.
Right.
There's not some obvious thing to cut that won't be politically unpopular. And it's not even like you might say, oh, well, if we ended all these crazy foreign wars, yeah, that would help. But going forward, no, the CBO, it's interest on the debt is one of the humongous components. Like we spent more on the debt servicing last fiscal year than they did on the military.
That's
just
crazy.
To show this is not something that, at some point our kids are going to deal with. No, this is right now.
That's crazy.
It costs more to just pay interest on the existing stock of debt that they already have issued, rather than what they spent with all the crazy stuff the military is doing right now. Right.
Well, look, man, sometimes you loan a drunk money and the drunk just doesn't pay you back. So, So what?
Yeah.
So we don't pay him back.
So I'm just answering this. So that's kind of where we are. And there's no easy way out of that. That's politically, but obviously if Dave Smith becomes president and asks me for you could do it. You could come up with numbers that would work and everything and sell off a bunch of federal assets, but that's a crisis is going to force that kind of an outcome is what I'm getting at. This is not going to be some painless thing. If we just campaign and, sent the right people, and if Cato and Heritage made the right white papers, no, that's not what's going to do it. It will be an absolute catastrophe that will force them to do things that are going to be terrible. My guess is, to answer your other question, I think they will do some combination of all the above. I think that, they will resort to the printing press to reduce the value of the dollar, and so that, in a sense, makes the existing debt weaker, so it's not as painful. Is one way of thinking about it. But they can't rely exclusively on that for various reasons, partly just because the issue isn't just the existing stock of debt. It's just going forward, like they're kind of trapped. So even if they printed more money to pay the interest on the existing one, as the debt rolled over, the interest rates would reset, right? Because, yields on treasuries would go up in nominal terms if all of a sudden they start printing boatloads of money, right? So that's really not too much they could do there. In other words, they couldn't just print $35 trillion and pay off the debt and say, okay, now we're going to be smooth going forward, and that would be a one-time shock and prices would skyrocket. They couldn't do that because they would then run a huge deficit next year anyway, because right now they're spending way more than they're taking in tax receipts. That's the issue, and that's just going to get worse over time as people get older and Medicare becomes a bigger portion of the budget. That's the problem. It's not just the existing debt; it's the fact that their finances are all out of whack. So I think they're going to do a combination of all of that. That pushing back the Social Security age at which you can start taking your paychecks, jacking up how much you got to pay into it that's taken out of your existing paycheck, and cutting back on all sorts of things. Maybe they won't explicitly default on the existing debt. I'm not sure if they cut on that, because again, that could be like a self-defeating. If they do that, that might just make the interest rates higher going forward. So if they could just do it once and then be running balanced budgets, they might cheat that way. But again, that's not a long term. If they have to keep borrowing money from the rest of the world, they can't.
Would you
screw
advise
everybody.
President Smith to do that? To do it, default once, cut federal spending down to almost nothing, and institute a, I don't know, 2% tariff on all goods and finance the teeny tiny government that remains that way?
I think what I would do is tax every word that he says in part of the problem, and that would restore some Robbie the Fire, Dave Smith equity.
True inequality.
Yeah,
it's a shame.
Yeah, there's hierarchies. I mean, that's tricky because, again, now I get into, well, everything is aggression. And okay, but yes, if Dave comes to me and he says, Bob, I can't just get up and say, everybody resign, yay, anarchy. Like, yeah, probably you're right. And there's some, both in terms of public finance, but also like libertarian ethics. The idea is, given that you're going to have to upset some people, it's not that the federal government, because they could sell off a lot of assets, but given that there's not enough to go around, there's no painless way to do this, that by privatizing all the oil and gas and selling off all the Western real estate and whatnot, if still we don't have enough to pay off, the idea is, okay, well, given that some people have to get screwed that in a sense are creditors of the U.S. government, it would be more ethical to rip off the people, to default on the obligations, at least partially, of the people who voluntarily lent the Treasury money by buying bonds, as opposed to workers, for example, who had money taken out of their paycheck against their will and say, oh, don't worry, you're going to get Social Security down the road. So rather than like cutting or clawing back, some of what they think their benefits are supposed to be, maybe default at least partially and say, oh yeah, you had a Treasury, you thought you wrote $1,000, we're only going to give you $950. That would be more ethical, because those people not getting paid back didn't have a gun put to their head to say, oh, you're going to contribute to this. So that's the argument for, given that the U.S. government has to default on its obligations, it would be better. Now, the reason people wouldn't do that in practice with finance ministers and whatnot is because the people in the Social Security program don't have some legally binding claim that they can go sue the government and say, what are you talking about? I had a contract with you. You're going to take out this amount from my paycheck, and then you're going to pay me this amount down the road. There's nothing like that. You know what I mean? It's just rough formulas, and hey, that is what it is. You can make forecasts about what you think you're going to get, but it's not that they're on the hook the way you lend money to the government by buying a Treasury bond. That's a contract, and if they don't pay you back, that looks bad. That's going to hurt their credit rating and their ability to raise capital in the future. But yes, to answer your question, I would, with Dave, get rid of the income tax, switch to a tariff system, because for privacy reasons, among other things, and also that's more of like a consumption tax than the the income tax is, and that's more efficient for various reasons. And sell off a ton of assets that the federal government owns. I did a back of the envelope thing for David Henderson a while ago. You could easily come up with $1 trillion without even trying, of federal assets.
Sure.
So that wouldn't solve the problem, but it would ease the pain and just start laying people out. You get rid of the IRS. Just one thing is, just if you got rid of everything that's not explicitly authorized in the Constitution, that would save a lot in terms of the government's salaries and stuff that they pay out.
Yeah, no doubt. I've got a pipe dream solution, possible way out of it, or a way to make it less bad. I want to run by you.
Okay.
Like in the 90s and up till now, the proliferation of the personal computer, its increase in power, and then the internet and how massively more productive that made us all, that clearly had to have helped a little bit mitigate some of the inflation that was coming out of the Fed. Similarly, I like to rock myself to sleep tonight as I'm weeping thinking about the financial future, that maybe some combination of robots and AI and nuclear power and improved batteries and electrical transmission lines technologies. Is there some way we can innovate ourselves into increases in productivity that give us some sort of a soft landing if we come to our senses as far as the spending goes? And I mean, do you think something like that could help, or should I just have nightmares all night? Choose carefully how you answer, Bob.
You're right. There are things on the horizon that I think would allow for the measured productivity of human labor to go through the roof. There's plenty of other things though you can have nightmares about. In fact, some of these things could, I think that they're building robot armies. So, or at least they're building the capacity to then crank out robot armies, put it that way.
Have you seen the flying drone that's a dragon, basically?
No, I haven't.
In Ukraine, it's just flying around and just spitting fire like something out of Game of Thrones.
Oh, jeez. No, I haven't seen that.
Well, if you want to never sleep again, see the dogs with the machine guns, and then
I've seen those.
The dragon.
Yeah, I haven't seen the dragon. I've seen flying killer drones, but I think like the ones I saw would home in on you and then blow up.
Yeah, there's plenty of those. And
I saw one. Did you see the thing where the guys are shooting at it?
Yeah, and then he throws
the gun, and then it hits it because it's easier to hit something with a gun than a bullet.
That guy's living a Hollywood nightmare.
Okay, but to answer your question, yeah, it was funny because I actually was almost painted myself into a corner rhetorically that as you know, I'm sure, I have been very pessimistic since 2008, at least, about the situation. And I'm going around and talking about, oh, this QE is not good, and then these deficits and blah, blah, blah. Okay. But then at the same time, or not the same time, but at the tail end of that period, when I started having conversations with GPT-4, I was like, whoa, this is amazing. People need it. And I was one of the boosters of that in that period, just telling people, guys, if you're just seeing like funny memes and stuff on Twitter or whatever, no, you really need to like have a conversation. I would put it in quotation marks and say, we can get philosophical. Well, is it a conversation? Are you really talking to whatever? It doesn't matter. The thing seems like it's having a conversation with you. And in terms of relevance to business, that's all that's important, that especially as, telecommuting becomes more of a thing. I was like, I'm not saying, obviously you got to go build a house. You can't use GPT-4 to carry the lumber around and build a shed in the backyard, obviously. But in terms of jobs that are just require intellectual processing, there are certain classes I thought, especially as it gets better, where they're going to be able to do it. And as businesses just stop and think, okay, how can we revamp our operations to be able to take advantage of this new type of worker? And I was just doing back of the envelope calculations, but because the thing is, it would be like $1 an hour or something for in terms of this thing's time. And that won't, that might change if the demand surges and whatnot, but still my point was, it's almost like now we have the ability to bring in almost a limitless supply of virtual workers who, depending on the task, probably have IQs. It's hard to pin down, but I was getting more out of GPT-4 than I was out of certain grad students when I was just trying to have help with my research. In other words, it didn't have common sense necessarily, but it had very particular knowledge, and you could sit there and go with the thing and get into a really deep, just to help me think through problems and whatnot. And to save me time to say, okay, I'm trying to work on a model like this. Can you? And then it would spit something out. And I'd say, no, that's not what I need because of blah, blah, blah. And it was like, oh, I'm sorry. Well, here, how about this? And it was like Tony Stark doing the deal in his house with that computer that helps him design
Jarvis.
stuff.
Yes. Yeah, I don't want to derail our conversation away from money, but I do think that AI is going to be a great tool. Well, first of all, I wouldn't even call this AI. It's an LLM. Those things are different. I think the artificial general intelligence is what we're all used to think of as AI, and this thing isn't that. It doesn't think, but it can help you think. It can feed you information and kickstart your own neural pathways. But what it's doing isn't thinking. A buddy of mine wrote a funny Substack where he played 20 questions with ChatGPT-4, and it doesn't. It says it's playing it with you, but it doesn't. It's not thinking of a thing. It's just putting words down.
Funny. So it was like its turn to think of something, and then he was asking
and it just
questions.
doesn't. It says it did, but then it doesn't. It never did. So you're not playing 20 questions with it. It's not thinking. And of course, there's the hallucinations. As soon as it rolled out, I asked it for a list of books to help me play deuce to seven triple draw low ball as an expert, and it said, "You betcha. Here's 5." 2 of the books existed. One of them was a real book with a real author. It wasn't about that game. Another book was a real book by a different author that it got wrong. It wasn't about that game. And the other 3 books, it completely invented both book and author. So
and with confidence, right?
Oh, yeah. It would fool you. It's a good bluffer, but it's not thinking. I wanted to ask you about modern monetary theory because that's clearly insane. But I
Well, can
think
I just stop you for a second? Just again, we don't want to leave people hanging. So just to link those two things. So on the one hand, I was super pessimistic, but then on the other hand, I was like making back of the envelope calculations saying, it'll take some time for businesses to revamp, but in a sense, it's like they've got access to this class of worker that is suitable for certain things. And I was saying, so, we really got to get ready. And so I was almost, and so I was trying to thread the needle and saying, I don't think I'm contradicting myself. I think by the time this AI revolution really comes on board, this fiscal monetary stuff I've been warning about for a long time will have already, sunk in. So that's
let me,
I believe that. Like, I don't think I'm just saying like, oh shoot, I don't want to,
sure,
contradict myself. And so this is the way I'm going to reconcile my two. I think the timing does work out the way I said, where this crisis is going to hit before
and I don't want
AI
people
can
to
save us. But
I don't want people to misunderstand me. I don't think it thinks. I don't think it's going to be a worker like that. But I do think it's going to make every organization and employee that uses these LLMs intelligently. It's going to make them way more productive. Just generating content and handling scut work and.
Well, let me say this. The people that Michael Malice calls NPCs?
Sure.
And for people like non-player character, right? So people arguing on social media and they have their talking points. You can sit there and show them why what they're saying makes no sense, and they just don't
Not
process
a problem.
and they move on. My point though, Adam, is I bet you a lot of those people have a job.
Right. It's a good point.
And so I'm saying, again, you can get philosophical. I'm not making the philosophical. I'm a Christian. Like, obviously, I don't think that GPT-4 has a soul. So I'm not saying, but I'm just saying in terms of, can they get the job done and whatever? I think more and more jobs over time, that the answer will be yes. And they can do it at a fraction of the cost. They don't need to sleep. They're not going to come in drunk.
Or it'll be like
start a fight.
Or it'll be like the steam shovel. Where now one guy using this tool can do the work of 100 guys before. Right. It'll be like that.
Yes.
So I got a couple more questions. I'm not going to talk about modern monetary theory. I'm going to link people to your many, many, many conversations and writings and podcasts about that. But I am curious what your thoughts are as to global, quote unquote, de-dollarization as other, BRICS comes online and people start moving away from our dollar hegemony. How is that going to impact us? And is there a tomorrow? Bob, is there a tomorrow?
Yes. So this has been a trend that's been going on, and that's the main point I kept coming back to. So people know, what was that? February of 2024, I was in a zero hedge debate. Jim Rickards was in my team. Brent Johnson and Michael Avery were on the other side. And the idea, I think we said by 20, did we say 2030? I forget. They made us pull up the date to make it more exciting than the original resolution. But in any event, we were arguing that the dollar was going to lose global reserve currency status pretty soon. All right. So
in the resolution, how did you define the term?
I think we said will be the dominant, will be the global reserve currency, I think is what we said.
Right, but how would you define that? Like the dollar isn't 100% of transactions, so what percentage is?
I don't remember if we spelled out, because there's different ways of. So yeah, there's like in foreign, like central banks have foreign exchange reserves, so that's one popular metric to say.
If those are held in dollar, yeah, okay,
right.
And oil,
and things like that, and gold is a big thing, and so that is when that particular metric it was like in the 70% as of 2000, and then it's come way down since then. So my point was it will be below 50%, just extrapolating from past trends, I think by 2041, something like that. And so all you need to do is say, I think it's going to accelerate. It's the kind of thing where if everybody thinks the dollar's king, it's going to be king. But once some people start doubting it, and then you start just looking at the numbers like, whoa, yeah, I want to get out before this thing crashes, I think it will unravel quickly. So there's that element. You're right, Adam. There's different, like George Gammon, I think, was showing, if you just look at it in the financial markets and what share of a currency that's used in foreign places instead of the local currency, yeah, there the dollar's way bigger in terms of just day-to-day transactions as opposed to reserves held by central banks. So that's true. But in any event, yeah, I think that's going to happen. I don't know that it's going to be because the BRICS nations are all going to agree and have their own rival currency that they jointly issue, because it's kind of like the different mob families all trying to come up with an agreement. It's hard. Cartels are hard to enforce and
Hard
so
to
forth.
enforce.
But I think the rise of blockchain technology in terms of global finance, I think it's going to be easier for alternatives to the dollar to emerge, including things that are backed by real commodities, like just easier for people to own blockchain-based digital tokens that entitle you to some gold that's held in a safe vault somewhere that's not in the middle of a civil war that the U.S. authorities can't seize. So I think that will, as opposed to an explicit agreement between Russia and China and so forth, is that the BRICS people might go to those systems, in the meantime, and then over time, I think that will, in the long run, supplant the dollar. Not that the dollar is going to all of a sudden be worth one thing and then the next day be zero, but just I think over time its status is going to erode as people are just going to want to get away from that system.
Do you think the trend is reversible? Like if President Smith with you as his advisor were to, reverse our disastrous foreign policy and, start making the dollar much more sensible and more attractive, even as a central bank, fiat currency, do you think BRICS would fall apart because it is a cartel and the reserve currency status of the dollar would start to strengthen again? Or do you think the forces are too entrenched the other way?
Well, a lot would probably depend on the earlier question you asked. Would I be telling President Smith to default on treasuries, right? Because when we say people abroad are holding dollars,
right,
we don't mean literally 100, even though they do hold a bunch of actual literal $100 bills. But yeah, it's mostly like dollar denominated assets, including like treasuries. So in general, I would think the things I would suggest to President Smith, so long as he kept the dollar as a thing, would strengthen it. But that might be a hiccup if they defaulted on the debt. In general, I think that would help the long-term strength of the dollar and would delay the conversion. Foreigners, if they became reassured, oh, finally, there's some sensible people in Washington and they're going to get their fiscal house in order, then I think that would delay the erosion of the dollar as its role in global finance. But these other things I think are still coming anyway.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, but I was just curious what you thought. I have a question about F.A. Hayek and his competing currency idea. If I remember correctly, he was saying that was a way, like even in the existence of fiat money, if you just allowed competing currencies, maybe, we would choose our way out of it, select our way out of it. Do you think that was true then? Do you think that's something that, assuming there was the political will, which there never would be, but do you think that would work in a fiat money system?
Okay, so his proposal, he was saying, just like we don't typically think government monopolies are good at making cars or growing food or whatever, why would we want governments to have monopolies on the production of fiat money? And he said, now, normally we as economists, from a sound money perspective, we object to government issued fiat money, and we say we should just go back to market based commodity money. And then he was saying, though, well, why? Maybe it would still be better to have market based fiat money. And so his proposal was just have different companies, they issue different currencies, and the way they would get them off the ground. So a lot of people don't know this, but in the beginning, the way they would get, because how would you know how much, if some firm's issuing notes that are Hayeks, like this is a 10 Hayek note, this is 100 Hayek, when he first launched it, how would anyone know what it was worth? And he was saying, when you first launch it, have it be redeemable in some basket of other currencies. And that would give it, some market value in the beginning, just so traders would know how to price the thing. But then each company issuing its own note, it would maintain its purchasing power relative to some metric that it thought its customers would want. And so his idea was that, if there's some kind of company that specializes in mining, then maybe it wants its basket of commodities to be, a bunch of metals. And so, it wants to have assets that are tied to that thing. Like that's the index that it uses. And so the idea was that the firm that issuing these notes would just adjust the quantity of the notes outstanding to maintain stability in whatever that metric was. And so people would just know, okay, I can have that. Or, it could be gold, and, and the thing would just be, so it would be a fiat money. It's not that it would entitle you to the gold, but it would just, its value would be regulated as such. But in general, you could have things tied to some basket of consumer goods. And so then you would just know, oh, if we use this thing as the money, these Hayeks that are issued by this firm, and that's what the merchants, the grocery stores use, that's what I get paid in. And that thing just has constant purchasing power relative to that basket of consumer goods. And so like the measured rate of CPI inflation would be zero on that measure. So that was the idea. And he was just saying that he's doing economic analysis, just showing with competition and what would the public would gravitate towards those note issuers that did a better job of maintaining the purchasing power relative to what their announced metric was. And then people could gravitate towards the metrics that appealed to them for their reason, various reasons, and then the companies that did a better job of hitting those targets. So that was the idea.
And I suppose along with that, you'd have to, strike down the capital gains tax and whatever sales tax to make sure nothing was getting in the way of them being used.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of what would stop that from happening, I don't remember if Hayek talked about that in the monograph. It wasn't really a book, but it also wasn't just like an essay. It was kind of a longer thing. I think they call it a monograph. I don't remember him specifically addressing those types of issues, but yes, if you're asking me, how come that hasn't happened yet? I think that would be one of the issues, is that it's, that as that thing would be treated as an asset. And then if you accept that your boss paid it to you, paid you 100 Hayeks for your week of work, and a Hayek at that point measured in dollars, traded 1-to-1. And then as the dollar, eroded over time and you're just sitting on your Hayek, you just put it under your mattress, right? That's the whole point. You can the thing maintains its value. And then, the dollar price of those Hayeks goes up 4 or 5% a year. When you went to sell it, you'd have a capital gain on that. And so that would be one of the reasons that wouldn't take off. Having said that, though, I think another reason in practice, because Hayek, I think, wrote that, I want to say in the 70s, is just if you were going to go to the trouble of doing that, you'd probably just hold gold.
Yeah.
Right. There's that element. And then now with, I think Bitcoin fulfills that vision, but in a decentralized way.
Yeah.
Right. Because that was the thing, too, was there were some like academic critiques of that once a firm got into that position where a lot of the public was using it, they were showing they could benefit from a one-time surprise inflation. You know what I mean? Like if you get the whole world using your currency, your notes, you could just print up a bunch and then buy a bunch of stuff. And then by the time everybody realized what was going on, you don't have the real estate and have the stock market around the world, that kind of deal. So that's kind of the benefit of Bitcoin, where it's decentralized, that it's not that, if we all start using Bitcoin, then the people running Bitcoin are going to take advantage of us. That can't happen.
Well, we're running a little long, Bob, so I just have one more very important theoretical money question for you.
Sure.
I'd like your opinion on who of the following three is your favorite money theorist. F.A. Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, or Pink Floyd?
I suppose if it's a late night at the frat house, you'd rather listen to Pink Floyd than a lecture from the other two. But yeah, in my mind, Mises, it's not even close in terms of, and I think even Hayek would agree that Hayek was more just writing on a bunch of different topics and was more of a, hey, look at the connections between this and this over here. And he was also very deep. I don't mean to say like he only superficially touched stuff. Like his capital theory stuff was incredibly deep, but he was not like a system builder. And so like Mises coming in and just laying out, like, this is the taxonomy, this is how we're going to classify. There's commodity money and credit money and fiat money, and these are the classifications, and we're going to do all this. And how should we view money? Is it part of, is it a capital good? Is it a consumption good? And no, we're going to call it a medium of exchange. All that stuff Mises did. So I think, to me, Mises is one of the best economists of all time.
Mises is the man, yo. Well, you were great. Thank you for answering all those questions. Is there something money related that you wanted to get off your chest that I didn't prompt you to reveal?
I mean, well, we teased him with the $1 trillion platinum coin. Do you want
We
to hit that
did.
real fast?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the deal with that was it was during the one of the recurring debt ceiling standoffs, and so the idea was that back, I think it was in World War I, when Congress was just having trouble appropriating funds to pay for the war effort. They got the flexibility that, okay, you can, the Treasury can issue debt without getting an explicit authorization on that particular issuance from Congress, right? Because that's how much hand holding there used to be involved. And so the Treasury got that flexibility, but Congress, I would say wisely, said, okay, yeah, the Treasury can now just start issuing bonds without our explicit oversight on the particular issuance. But at any given time, we're going to have a cap on how much outstanding Treasury debt there can be. And I think that was their way of just trying to make sure they didn't hand over the keys. And so that's what gives rise to this. I'm sure the listeners are familiar with this. Usually it happens when there's a Democrat in the White House and the Republicans control the Congress, and they say, no, we're not going to approve raising the debt ceiling unless you meet our demands. And so there was an idea that arose to cleverly get around that by saying, there was some guy, there was like a provision. It was to allow for the issuance. It was allow the Treasury to issue platinum coins. And they were like for commemorative purposes. It was just like, it's the anniversary of D-Day, or I'm making that up. I don't remember what the deal was, but you know what I mean? Like a small platinum coin that wasn't worth very much. And yeah, the federal government is giving the Treasury the legal ability to coin these things. Okay. And so then they were saying, all right, well, what if with this debt ceiling standoff and the Republicans are saying, no, we're not going to, even though the spending we've all approved, and the government, the executive branch is supposed to now go and spend all this money, and the tax receipts aren't there, and so they would have to issue bonds to pay for it, right? And no, we're saying you're not allowed to do that. So they were arguing, you've placed us in an impossible situation, like constitutionally, we're supposed to spend the money that Congress told us to spend, and yet you're not letting us borrow the funds to do it, and we can't tax without congressional authority. So they said, okay, well, guess what, smart guys? You already gave us back in this thing that was passed a few years ago, the authority for the Treasury to make platinum coins. So we're going to take a platinum coin, stamp it, and write on it $1 trillion US. And then we're going to the Treasury is going to deposit that in the Federal Reserve into its checking account balance. And then the Fed's going to credit the Treasury with $1 trillion. I was about to say a million. That's chump change.
That's
$1 trillion.
change.
And now we've just raised $1 trillion without having to go borrow. That that's not debt. We're allowed to do that, right? So that was the argument. And at first, people just thought that was a joke. Like Jon Stewart has a great thing. If we can find it, we'll link it in the show notes page, folks, where he made fun of that. But a bunch of left-wing progressive types more and more got on board with that. Like to say, okay, Republicans, we're going to call our bluff. We'll do this. We're going to do this. And so that's where the idea came from, and that's where it had a bunch of left-wing economists defending it and saying, this isn't a joke. This makes total sense. What are we talking about? I mean, this is kind of like what we're doing anyway, right? And that's what I thought was great. Like it kind of, I think, shocked the public to show, you see, that's what it comes down to nakedly, is they're just taking something and saying, this is worth $1 trillion, everybody, because we said so.
Oh, it's brilliant. It is the second most brilliant economic monetary innovation I've ever seen. You know what the first one is? Of course you don't.
When you go in the store and you put the pennies in and they turn it into like a little elephant or something.
That's art. No, it's in Hitchhiker's Guide, if you're familiar. You think that
I don't want to lose my nerd cred. I know what you're talking about. I've never actually read it.
Never actually read it? Shame on you. Well, one of the many plot lines that's hilarious is our planet didn't evolve from the great apes that were our distant cousins or whatever. No, actually our planet, life on this planet was seeded by the useless third of some other planet who was tricked into getting on a rocket and being sent here. The rest of the society that's useful, they're going to come on the other two rockets. Well, Nobody ever boarded those other 2 rockets. It was a ruse to get rid of the goofballs. So we evolved from the goofballs that landed here. And the first thing that the captain did when he landed on his planet in a very leafy forest was to decide to officially decree that the leaf is the unit of currency. And hey, we're all rich.
Well, there you go.
Well, this has been amazing, Bob. I hope we continue to do these crossovers. If you are watching this conversation or listening on the Bob Murphy show, please go to YouTube and look for Haman Nature. And also, please check out my Substack at hamannature.substack.com. And if you are watching or listening on the Haman Nature Show, Bob, where should people go to find you?
Just go to bobmurphyshow.com.
That's it, and that's all. No Mises plug, no love?
Well, yeah, I host the Human Action podcast over at Mises.org. And also just find me on Twitter. That's where you'll find everything. That's really where you should go. So I'm Bob Murphy Econ over there at Twitter, or X, as they say. And that I post everything I do there. So that's where you'll find me.
I underwrite that claim. Bob's Twitter game is strong. Well, thanks again, Bob. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This has been awesome. And we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Adam, for having me, as always. And I also applaud you folks at home.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.